nation was founded as a Christian nationalist form of government built upon biblical Judeo-Christian principles. It's not just a political thing. I hear people say, oh, you guys are just propping up a person and Trump and all of that. And I'm like, no, we're propping up what he has stood for. We're just simply getting behind what a man chose to stand for. We have a president, a real president, who has stood more for the body of Christ and his church to be liberated. In my lifetime, he's the only president that even dared challenge the lying Johnson Amendment that intimidated pastors behind their pulpit. And I'm just here to prophesy in this room and to everybody that's watching, those days are over. We're not going to be intimidated. I don't care what they said about what amendment. We're not going to be intimidated. We are going to do what God has called us to do. Not going to stop talking about the lies. I don't care what they write in the newspaper. We're not stopping, because the truth of God must be heralded from the mountaintops. It must be spoken on the airwaves. And I don't care what they write in CNN. I don't care what they put in Newsweek. Let them write it all day long. The Bible said no weapon formed against you can prosper.
So not too long ago, maybe around, I don't know, December of last year, we actually did an episode discussing the reality of Christian privilege in America and how this privilege impedes political and social progress and diverse societies. Today, though, we wanted to build upon that topic by focusing on the ideology that has led to Christian privilege, which is this idea of Christian nationalism.
And to be clear, the two are very much linked together. You don't get any privileges until a standard is created for it in society. And in this case, the default setting in the US has always been white, male, and later evolved to include evangelical Protestant belief. And I specifically say evangelical and not just Christian, because white Christian, white American conservative evangelical Christians, which is where Christian nationalism comes from, these particular Christians, girl, they go hard in trying to distinguish themselves from other Christian denominations like the Catholics or even more liberal denominations. In fact, the vast majority, if not all white supremacist groups, many of whom consider themselves Christians, tend to include Catholics and Jews and Black Christians among the people they hate.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. I know when I think about how Christianity is discussed in some predominantly white Christian circles, and I know this because I've had exposure to a lot of them as friends or family members of friends. But once you get past the general commonality of being Christian, if you spend enough time learning about their version of Christianity, it's either this colorblind perspective that ignores racial disharmony and racial justice issues in an attempt to be like this feel-good faith for everyone, or they get really specific about who's really a Christian, whether they're trying to tie it to patriotism or to a specific denomination or even like race. I know the Southern Baptist Convention, they're actually the largest Protestant denomination in the US, and there's a deep history of racism in that group. And I'm not talking about like just during the days of slavery, but even today, they are still wrestling with this idea of whether or not to let Black ministers, hold appointive positions within the denomination. So
insert eye roll, girl.
I know.
And hard sigh.
Exactly. And it's just like what you said. There's just something fishy about the evangelical group, especially white conservative evangelicals who created this idea of Christian nationalism. But, anyway, let's just dive right in. I guess quick confession. I mean, before we started digging deep into this topic, I have to admit, like, I didn't even know there was a term for a lot of the things that I was seeing. I didn't know that Christian nationalism was a thing, but I was seeing it play out, just in different circles. And I know Black folks, especially anyone who's, tied to the Black Christian church, we've seen it, we've talked about it, conversations about how different white churches were in their mannerisms and their biblical interpretations that they prefer to hold. It was just very different from how the Black church saw and experienced the world. And I guess in this case, experienced the US.
And I think every Black Christian has at some point talked about, maybe even laughed about, the cultural differences between Black and white churches. And then you have the multi-ethnic churches who act like there aren't any cultural differences between the two, but there really is. And that shouldn't surprise anyone because, like any community of people, language and style and history and shared experiences are going to play a major role in how business is conducted. And just so we're all on the same page, church in this capitalistic society is definitely a business.
Oh, yeah. Corporate greed in Jesus' name. I mean, that's really how we got so many mega churches in this country today.
Not in Jesus' name.
But yeah, I mean, for those that don't know, Christian nationalism, today, it's a term that means, or basically that describes people who really do believe that their government exists to promote and protect just Christian values.
And that belief, though, Danielle, that belief, that Christian nationalist belief, that's what's dangerous. That's what makes them an existential threat to everything and everyone who doesn't fit that Christian box. It's Christian nationalists who keeps pushing this narrative. And if you start paying attention after I say this, you will hear it. But they start pushing this narrative of a return to what America used to be, as if this was founded as a Christian nation. Talk about marketing. But the awkward thing about it is that it's extremely easy to find evidence that disproves this narrative. All you have to do is look at the founding documents, a treaty, or the ideological makeup of the founders themselves. Like, it's right there. And I'll get into that in a second. But nothing in early American history supports the claim that we were founded as a Christian nation.
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest, the version of Christianity as practiced here in the US, it's not the Christianity as preached and practiced by early Christians or even Christians in other parts of the world, like the Middle East or throughout Africa, which is the literal birthplace of most of the religions in the world. I mean, here in the US, we've been given this like slaveholding, colonized, fire and brimstone, obey your master, just truly bastardized version of Christianity that's been laced with white supremacy and male supremacy. And honestly, it's the only kind of Christianity that could work in a slaveholding, deeply racist nation like the US. In fact, I'm thinking of at least 2 books for anyone that's looking to just freshen up on the role religion played in early US history and the kind of Christianity that did develop here. There's a book called Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America by Ibram X. Kendi. And then there's another book called Reconstructing the Gospel, Finding Freedom from Slaveholder Religion. That one's by a Christian minister named Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove. Both books are just excellent and capturing the root, really, of how Christianity was constructed into the handmaiden of racism in America.
I would love to know what the non-bastardized version includes in terms of like values, the supreme authority, punishment, and even atonement. I do know that you often distinguish between, like you just mentioned, early Christianity and this westernized version that we have. But the thing is, though, removing misogyny, racism, and the bigotry, yeah, it may get us closer to an original version, but the claims in the book should still be met with skepticism, especially where it makes claims about the natural world.
Yeah, I mean, criticism, that's something that just that critical eye, everyone should approach all topics that way. I know that when I make that distinction, it's just because I think that it's important for people to acknowledge that, for one, Jesus, whether he really lived or not, never in the Gospels or even the Old Testament does it say or imply that he died for people to walk around calling themselves Christians. The focus of his ministry was on renewing the mind, building community by having empathy and showing compassion for your neighbor and getting right with God. It was not about persecuting or condemning or enslaving and forcing people into the faith, which is a product of Western Christianity. And sure, we see a lot of those themes in the Old Testament, but for those who only focus on, who say they want to focus on the teachings of Jesus, you know, he never told people to go around condemning folks and harassing folks and forcing people into a religion and calling it Christianity. In fact, the term Christian and the religion Christianity came well over a century after his supposed death. And how people in that region did church looked very different than how churches operate today, which is more like a business as opposed to a socialist community that the early church reflected. And like I say, socialist, and I can just feel the conservative evangelicals just turning in their seats right now. But no, really, the westernized version of Christianity is a result of the Emperor Constantine assembling all of the competing ideas about Christ and Christianity together so that he and a handful of men could decide on one single view of Christ to force everyone else around the world under. And that's the view that we have today. And that's what I mean when I distinguish between the diverse and socialist nature of early Christianity versus what we have today, which is born out of westernized Anglo perceptions of Christianity.
Now, I definitely agree. Churches should get back to their socialist roots. I don't know. I just also want to point out that, again, if you remove all those other things, not everything Jesus said was even necessarily sound or even good advice. We literally have no way, like you pointed out, even if he did live, which even as an atheist, I'm completely okay with accepting that a man named Jesus existed. But we just have no way to even verify that he was even divine. But believing that is crucial to whether or not we even burn in hell. Like that's a central question. But my point is this. Now, I'm not saying to throw the baby out with the bathwater and be an atheist. I'm just saying that, as you pointed out, Danny, that we should still, no matter the topic, use critical thinking, even for our own faiths, and skepticism, right? Like, I guess, be skeptical of your skepticism. But still, the underlying issue, though, is that Christian values are steeped in supremacy, whether it's the idea of one God being supreme and jealous over people wanting to worship other gods, or even no gods, or even this idea that Jews and Christians are the most favored by God over other people. The point is that at the root, supremacy is a common theme in Christianity. So it's no wonder that people would add other supremacist values to the mix. And not just white supremacy, which gave way to racism, but also male supremacy, which gave us patriarchy and misogyny, and religious supremacy, which is exactly how we got Christian nationalism.
Yeah. And in America specifically, we do have this notion of American exceptionalism, right? Which is not too far removed from Christian nationalism. For those that don't know, American exceptionalism is this deeply problematic and supremacist idea that America was just destined to be a nation above all nations with the moral duty and support of God to defend freedom and democracy across the globe. And look, even if that were true, and it's not, but let's just say God did look down on America in her infancy with all of her slavery and racism and misogyny and oppression, and declared that this is a nation that was going to represent him and be the nation above all nations, whose sole purpose is to defend democracy and freedom. I mean, like, can we just admit that we have never lived up to that standard for the last 400 years? Like, where we've worked together in diversity, sure, we have done well in some things, But most of this nation still operates from a place of white supremacy, even in religious matters. And what has come out of that is rogue capitalism, again, in Jesus' name, colonialism turned American imperialism in Jesus' name, and xenophobia and religious intolerance in Jesus' name. And I don't mean just being mean to people of different faiths or denominations or being mean to atheists when I say like religious intolerance. I mean a solid history of burning down Black churches just because, they were aiding Black communities in our fight for freedom, which apparently went against white ideological interpretations of freedom. And if we be honest, many predominantly white churches today still preach this idea that Black folks are cursed by God with Black skin. And as such, Black people have a natural disposition for inferiority compared to other races, and that we can only be saved by assimilating into white culture. It's ridiculous, right? And there are other forms of religious intolerance within Christian nationalism that exist here too, like how Muslims are treated and talked about in the US, or how Jews aren't accepted in many Christian circles unless they convert to Christianity. And I mean, that's born out of white interpretations of the Bible, pinning Jews as the cause for Jesus being crucified. But yeah, religious intolerance shows up in a myriad of ways in America. Even atheists get a bad rap from Christians. But I think because atheists, y'all be clapping back at the church, the crap that you guys get from Christians is like water off a duck's back, because y'all really do have the time to argue with Christians on the internet, and I just don't.
Girl, we don't even be having the time. We make the time for these folks, girl. Because I'm telling you, child, I read some comments most days, and I'm like, okay, you know how you got to rub your temples and everything, and I be wanting to walk away, but you got to make time to gather these people. We're doing a whole podcast on them, aren't we? About them inserting themselves. Apparently you got to damn step up. And the thing is, catch this, most of the time, the topics that we're debating about, and I do air quotes, use that loosely, but most of the time, the topics we're even going back and forth about, it even on the central question that separates atheists from Christians to begin with, which is, is there a God or are there gods? That's the central question, right? We ain't even arguing about that. It's always on some topic that they've hijacked as a wedge issue, then have to scramble on the back end to find a Bible quote to support that argument, which always backfires. Okay, well, more often than not, I'm going to be fair. More often than not, that tactic backfires. Going back to the ways Christian nationalism manifests in America, one way is through Christian fundamentalism and the evangelical Christians trying to dismantle public education. Now, if we were to appease the Christian nationalist agenda, the public school curriculum will be based on the teachings of the Bible, like it was back in the early days in parts of Europe. Y'all probably remember learning about how Galileo and other pioneers were called heretics and even killed for following the way of science and facts as opposed to religious doctrines. And let's be clear, the issue here is that the Bible is not a history book nor a science book. I understand it is your faith, but you can at least be honest. Well, hell, that's probably a tall ask too. Because I thought about that because that's what I'm up against. Because they're convinced that the Bible is a history and a science book. And in many cases, the Bible, y'all, just be honest. You can remove your rose-colored glasses, but the Bible is an era in a number of places where both of those areas are concerned, both science and history. Now, take for instance, Genesis chapter 1, verses 11 through 19. Plants are made on the third day before there was even a sun to drive their photosynthetic processes. Try to grow a plant without the sun. I mean, come on, guys. Seriously. Also, the theory of evolution, which is taught in public schools. The theory of evolution is in direct conflict with the idea that God created man, which is an essential component of Christianity. And slight sidebar, because I know it's somebody out there thinking, but it's just a theory. But theory, the way we use it in a colloquial sense, the talking to my homegirls, my homeboys type way, is not the same way a scientist means theory. Completely different. By the time a scientist uses the word theory, they have a whole body of work,
Yep.
evidence, peer-reviewed research to back it up. But nevertheless, you have to deduce, right, that you've got this one idea that's so essential to Christianity, which is that God created man, and here's evolution saying no, that's not how that happens. You have to at some point the rubber's going to meet the road, and you have to think, if evolution is true, then Genesis is false. If Genesis is false, then there's no Adam and Eve, no original sin, and no atonement through Christ. Hell, Christ, if we keeping it 100, he wouldn't even be needed, because what else was his purpose to begin with? Christians understand this, Danny, and they have to protect their beliefs at all costs.
Yeah, yeah. And here's the thing, though, you pointed out something important because it's like a central theme to Christian nationalism, this whole idea of infiltrating the education system to promote a specific culture, particularly white evangelical Christian culture, as the official culture of the country. White evangelicals have literally, I mean, they've worked centuries trying to enshrine a Christian nationalist interpretation of American history into the school curriculum. That's why there was so much pushback from white Christian conservatives on the whole critical race theory discussion, because critical race theory, it's a factual representation of American history through the lens of race, but more importantly, it's an expose of the ahistorical stories we've been taught about America. You know, everything from Christopher Columbus, you know, supposedly discovering America. We know he didn't. But this idea also that the Pilgrims were just peacefully celebrating Thanksgiving with the indigenous Native Americans, or the lie that enslaved Africans were just happy about being enslaved and going to church with their masters. This is what Christian nationalists fight to put and keep in the K through 12 school books. And all of this goes against the whitewashed bedtime stories, you know, critical race theory and the theory of evolution. It just rips apart those Christian beginnings. And, you know, I'm just going to say fairy tales about the beginnings of the world. You know, it's not a history book, it's not a science book, but for Christian nationalists, they don't want any other books teaching the kids, only the Bible.
Which brings us back to the topic of Christian privilege and how that shows up in societies. We shared a few examples of Christian privileges in our previous episode. Examples like how Christians can worship freely in the U.S. without fear of violence or threats or even being mocked and harassed to the same degree as those people practicing other faiths or even people of no faith. You can go anywhere in the US as a Christian and assume you'll be surrounded by members of your faith. You can disclose your faith to an adoption agency, and it's less likely to prevent you from being able to adopt children. Hell, it probably will get you bumped to the top of the list. In fact, there are specific agencies that do, in fact, honestly give preference to believers. The Catholic Church has an organization in Philly that literally said we want to discriminate on the basis of sexual preference or sexual orientation. But the issue was about them being able to discriminate and take government funds because the government was helping to fund them. So go figure. But check the Supreme Court on that. I almost want to say I know which way they decided, but since I forgot it specifically, I don't want to tell you that lie. We all know the conservative outcry about the war on Christmas and how people who prefer to say happy holidays instead of Merry Christmas are looked at as enemies of Christianity because Christian Americans have been so used to Christianity being the default cultural setting here, even though we're not even a Christian nation. People of other faiths are expected to learn about Christianity and respect holidays, but no such precedent is set for Christians to learn about other religions and respect their cultures. I didn't think I would have to remind you all, but the United States didn't even have an official religion. So, like, can we stop? Texas, but an organization they're suing right now in the Supreme Court to see why their Christian flag can't be flown on. It's on state grounds, so government grounds, why their flag can't be flown. Like all other flags have been represented at that same place. The LGBTQ flag, Palmia, some other flags don't really have anything to do with religion. And in that way, I might actually think that they may have a case only because that government institution there has already been flying other flags. So
Yeah.
I hope they don't try to take that shit and run with it, but I could see if they won that one. Because if those were just the facts of the case, I too would probably decide in that favor. Hell, you're flying everything else. Girl, these people, you give them a little rope and they want to be a cowboy. Dead ass. You get these people, these type of people ropes, a little rope, or they turn into cowboys quick. So be careful with that. But yeah, moving on. A more recent example as well of Christian privilege that comes to mind is the Nazarene Fund, which is a nonprofit led by Glenn Beck and Tim Ballard, both conservatives and both involved in supposedly rescuing Christians from persecution by ISIS terrorists in Afghanistan. Even though they aren't the only religious group being persecuted in that region. I mean, come on. I mean, I get having a target audience, but how does that even work in that setting? Your organization would what? Turn away a Muslim mother or a Jewish mother and her children because they're not Christian, even though certain Islamic denominations and Jews are also being persecuted in Afghanistan? Like, what does one really say for real? Like, how does this go down? Well, sorry, we can't help you. Jesus said I can only help Christians. Like, come on, make it make sense.
I can't even make that make sense. And it's interesting to see so many Republicans, conservatives, just really celebrating that organization's efforts and savings. And I say supposedly saving the Christians too, because I don't know the numbers and what's really going on. I know that Glenn Beck and them are complaining that the American government is making it harder for them to achieve that mission. But for me, I'm just like, I wonder what the American government knows about whatever you're doing out there. Because for me, I don't see the love of Jesus and only helping Christians or people you think are most like you. In fact, to me, it's a contradiction, because if it's really about favoring Christians, 83% of the immigrants coming out of Latin America, they're Christian. And yet white conservative evangelicals are constantly lambasting Latino immigrants and are staunchly opposed to what can easily be considered Christ-like immigration policies for Latinx communities. And I mean, the same goes for their sentiments towards Haitian and African immigrants who are also largely Christian. So, when I hear this whole idea of saving Christians from persecution and then looking at how we're just fast tracking Haitians back to Haiti, and Haiti's not even in a position to, receive Haitians. It's all just plain old racism wrapped in Christmas wrapping paper, if you ask me. But anyway, just going deeper into this Christian nationalism, we do have to look at this new concept. Actually, it's new for me, but it's actually not new. I don't know how many people out there have heard of the term Judeo-Christian and wondered, like, what is that about? Because if you examine the people who tend to call themselves Judeo-Christians today, it's mostly the white conservative evangelicals, which is not the case. That wasn't the case during the civil rights era or even earlier. On the surface, I know that when I think about the term Judeo-Christian, like, it sounds like someone whose religious faith combines Judaism and Christianity, right? And since the only people who practice Judaism are Jews, like when I hear Judeo-Christian, it sounds like a Jew who's also a Christian, except that's actually not the case at all. The term is actually born out of the early 1900s, and it's in reference to the tri-faith belief, not to be confused with the Trinity, but an attempt to unify Protestantism, Catholicism, and Judaism, and an effort to challenge the religious supremacy in America at that time. And it sounds like a really cool idea for those three faiths to just like band together, especially since they were rising up against the typical American Christian of that time, which were people like Hiram Wesley Evans, who was an imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, Remember, we told you guys earlier that most white supremacists yesterday and today identify as Christian. I can't make it make sense for you. It's just the truth. But people like Hiram insisted on like defining the US as a Christian nation, and like, does that sound familiar? It sounds totally familiar. But their definition centered on white, American born, evangelical supremacy, which gave rise to white Americans being anti Catholic and anti Semitic and anti Black Protestant denominations like the AME Church. But anyway, these three faiths, the Protestants, the Catholics, and the Jews, they banded together for what was called the social gospel movement of the early 1900s. And they had a profound influence during World War II and even, after World War II, especially concerning the development of chaplains in the military, because Judeo-Christian values were centered on freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of religion. I mean, when we think of Christians today, especially evangelicals, they're so religiously intolerant. It's almost hard to believe of a Christian group that is religiously tolerant and is all about free speech and free thought. And, even Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. praised Judeo-Christian values, which is why we saw a lot of photos of him locking arms and marching with ministers of other faiths. But just like how the Republican Party today is not the Republican Party of the Reconstruction eras, those calling themselves Judeo-Christians today are not descendants of the people who were Judeo-Christians during the Civil Rights era or even the early 1900s. Today, we're more likely to see and hear white conservative evangelicals referring to themselves as Judeo-Christians, even though they do not embrace the religious tolerance or any of the values that came out of the social gospel movement. Today, like Judeo-Christians, and I can't even think of the name of the last guy that I saw on Twitter, proudly proclaiming to be Judeo-Christian and Trump supporter. But anyway, Judeo-Christian today, like it's synonymous with what that KKK member Hiram Wesley Evans represented, which is this idea of being white, American born, and an evangelical. And so like the hijacking of that term, it's just really disturbing if you think about it.
Girl, disturbing, absolutely. And not even new. And I think that's what really pisses me off about hijacking narratives and reframing stuff. And it happens all the time. We see these things like this happen in history. Girl, off the top of my damn head, if you think about the very few people who have been locked up due to the insurrection, right? Running all up into the Capitol. You got them crazy ass Republican politicians. I don't know if her last name is Boebert or however you say it, but Laura Lauren, whatever. The gun toting the crazy one. Well, hell, all of them crazy. The gun toting crazy one. Not to be confused with the Neanderthal looking crazy one. But look, so you've got Marjorie, you got Laura Lauren, whatever her name is. Girl, they're calling those people political prisoners. Imagine you legitimately trying to pass off the damn shaman dude as a political prisoner standing right next to Mumia. I mean, come on, like, don't play in my face like that. I was on social media the other day, and it was these two white. They were young adults. I can't tell that much. You didn't show their face, but you could tell they were younger. They were trying to get into this black-owned restaurant or whatever, right? But they didn't want to put on their mask, and the lady was trying to tell them, okay, put on your mask and come in, just the regular stuff. Do you know what? You could tell they even had no intention at all in even going in and eating. They just wanted to cause trouble. But do you know they started citing the fucking sip? Can we curse? Yeah, I can curse. It's my show. I say, can I not curse here? Sorry, y'all. But do you know they started citing and see stuff like this make you curse? They cited the daggone Civil Rights Act of 1964.
I saw that. The at this point, caucasity.
Girl, the absolute caucasity. I cannot to literally compare what people went through for that act to even be a thing to you not want to wear a piece of fucking cloth over your face. Girl, they're so aggravating. But yeah, and the girl they were talking to was a sister. And I'm like, just the irony in that. And then the black girl had on a Juneteenth shirt. Go figure. But I was just like, I'm like, are we in the damn like zone? But no, like you alluded to earlier, a lot of people really think that the same folks that make up today's GOP are the same Republicans from after the Civil War, when in reality, more people who think like Tupe Fiasco, your Mitch McConnells, and even your Miss Lindsey Grahams, these people are not the type of people who would support the kind of progressive changes that the early Republicans brought about. Like the end of slavery and the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau, or the awesome work of various Black and white abolitionists of that time. Like those are not even the same people, y'all. Let's start there, which is a reminder that the Republican Party has to do some work to even salvage themselves, or you guys might get that beloved third party you guys are asking about, but they want you to believe that and to forget about the Southern strategy, which is when the party agenda switched sides, especially around race. But I'll digress. But getting back to the point, America is not a Christian nation, no matter how many times a Christian tries to say it is. What we are seeing is a centuries long deliberate attempt to reframe America as a Christian nation by asserting, by claiming, by just because we said so when we got the numbers and power to prove it, essentially is what it is. They're trying to reframe this as America as being a Christian nation and being founded on Christian principles and values. Now, crazy thing is, not only is the evidence available for you, but it's actually been debunked many times over using, as I stated before, actual founding documents and words from the founders. Take, for instance, the Treaty of Tripoli. Article 7 of it says, as the government of the United States of America is not in any sense, founded on the Christian religion. I legit don't know how we can get any more clear than that. This was negotiated under George Washington at the time, signed by President Adams at the time, and consented to unanimously by the daggone Senate.
Yeah, I think you said Article 7. I think it's Article 11 for anyone that wants to go back and read it. Article 11, right? I think
Yes, it's Article 11, definitely Article 11. Then you have the First Amendment of the Constitution, which in part says Congress shall make no laws respecting an establishment of religion. That covers two things: not discriminating on the basis of religion, and Congress not making laws with respect to, regarding to, or giving preference to religion. Then you've got the no religious test clause, that says in Article 6, Clause 3 of the Constitution, that senators and representatives and all executive and judicial officers shall be bound by oath of affirmation to support this Constitution. But no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to do so, to hold public office or public trust under the United States. Shall not be required. Lastly, the founding fathers, one of them, James Madison, was super critical of letting religion and government share the same space. He said as much in the Federalist Papers number 10. Most of the founders were deists, uh, meaning that they believed in a non-intervening supreme being. Seriously, a stark contrast to the God of the Bible, who on all accounts is very handsy. You ask any Christian, he's in your life every step of the way, every hour. He's controlling everything. That's not non-intervening. But again, in stark contrast to the God of the Bible, who according to Christians not only cares about who you sleep with, but also has a special place in hell for you if it's not the appropriate gender. That does not sound like non-intervening to me. So yeah, not only did America not start off as a Christian nation, we actually see Christians just inserting themselves in an attempt to skew that fact. And I admit, their tactics, listen, girl, their tactics have been highly successful. You know how often I hear the following as reasons to why people say it's a Christian nation? All the time. I hear all the time. In God we trust is on our money, so we have to be a Christian nation. That's not a founding concept. That was added to coins in 1863, then paper money in 1956. And I'm gonna tell you why after this next one. One nation under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance around the 1950s. The 1863, as it relates to the paper money, that's right around the Civil War. One nation under God, Pledge of Allegiance. We were going through this whole communism, socialism scare. Okay, again, these are all tactics. What Christians saw and what they felt most importantly was that this world was in crisis. They need us now. Let's band together and since we're probably on our way out of here, this is the end times. You heard a lot of that then too. Let's go ahead and try to save as many souls as possible. So essentially what this is like their campaign inserting themselves, but it's their campaign to save souls, which always happens right around the time of crisis. So it all tracks. They'll also point to the Declaration of Independence, where it uses the words God, Creator, Nature's God, Supreme Judge of the world. And I know your little Christian ears, if you're listening, they're probably lighting up just hearing all of that. But I'm going to get to the point. You hear those words, as well as divine providence. And Christian nationalists, they hear and they see those and they say, see, it's a Christian nation. But where does any of that point directly to a Christian God? Would any other faith not also refer to those? Could they also not refer and appeal to those same words? It's not explicitly Christian. There's no mention of things that make it Christian-esque. There's no mention of Jesus, a Trinity, Yahweh, Jehovah, etc. They could be literally talking about anybody's God. It's a weird flex, though, to cite the Declaration of Independence as proof anyway, because it's a document completely different from the Constitution in function, period. It did not set up or structure our government. The Constitution did that. So Christians quoting the Declaration is wholly irrelevant. But look, even if none of that were true, Christian principles themselves are fundamentally opposed to America's principles, period. Take, for instance, the concept of original sin versus the presumption of innocence, and you tell me which one you would prefer to live under. Christianity teaches us that we are born sinners. You're guilty out of the gate. Whereas the Constitution grants us a due process as well as innocent until proven guilty. I'm not saying justice always works out. Those are moving part issues that us social justice warriors are trying to take care of. But these are that was the aspiration, or that is the aspiration of the country. So ask yourself, under which form of government would you rather live? If that's not convincing enough, maybe think about it in terms of authoritarianism versus self-governing. Daniel chapter 4, Daniel 4:17 says the Most High has sovereignty over mortals, but the Constitution again grants us the ability to self-govern through a concept called the consent to govern, which states that a government's legitimacy and moral right to use state power is justified and lawful only when consented to by the people. This is in opposition to a theocracy, which is what America would be if we were a Christian nation.
We could actually just go on and forever and a day, just accurately disputing the idea that America is a Christian nation. Like, we're not a Christian nation, nor have we ever been. This country was literally built on evading religious tyranny and, trying to establish a system of government that was secular. And by secular, I mean, or not even just what I mean, secular means it supported the idea of freedom of religion. That doesn't mean that you can't run your life and your home on Christian principles, but it is incorrect to think that the intent of the Constitution was to, foster Christian principles. It's just another form of supremacy to think that you as a Christian deserve privileges in this country over others simply because, your faith. I mean, these ideas around Christian nationalism coming from conservative evangelicals of all colors at this point, because even though they're mostly white, there's Black folks and others caught up in the mix too. But these Christian nationalist ideas in America, they're only a little over 100 years old, and they were exacerbated during the Trump presidency, where we saw religious and racist extremism just bust out of the shadows, demanding that we, make America great again by going back to a Christian history that never existed in this country. But it did exist: white supremacy. And thinking about how the Black church fared in all of this, it's a story that begins with enslaved Africans, with our own rich history and cultures and religion, some of which did include Christianity, though it looked very different from that of the people scooping us up into slavery. But all of them were brutally forced into this wayward religion that was construed to justify their enslavement. And with each new generation born under the racial and religious oppression, came more and more pressure for these Africans to assimilate. Number one, for survival reasons, for the Black Americans who took on the slaveholding, fire and brimstone interpretations of Christianity that we see coming out of the Southern Baptist Convention and even from some Republicans. Or number two, the assimilation came from a place of bringing various African cultures into Christianity, which is why we see so many Black churches today that are lively and spirited and just deeply connected to the needs and ambitions of the Black communities they serve. And, that was what I was speaking to earlier about just the difference between Black churches and white churches. Like, Black folks just had a different interpretation of Jesus and the gospel. But that's not to say that, all Black churches are to be praised, okay? Some of them are just as much a handmaiden of white supremacy as white churches. And if not white supremacy, then, male supremacy with a hyper focus on making women submit to male leadership. And even homophobia and abuses and corrupt capitalism that's just running rampant in Black churches today. I'm also thinking about like the over reliance on faith and, just like waiting on God and heaven to experience joy and freedom instead of getting up off your knees, rolling up your sleeves and doing the work, being vocal and open about social and economic justice instead of, tap dancing around the topic because you have, white people in your church. Like it bothers me so much so. But when I talk about Black churches getting back to, standing up for racial and economic justice, the economic justice meaning helping the poor, if you believe in Jesus, that was like one of the main things he talked about was the poor, because he came from poverty. And voting for policies and politicians who want to help end poverty instead of voting for policies and politicians who only look out for the rich and for corporations. Like, the Black church has been affected by Christian nationalism because I think today a lot of Black folks forsake their ethnic identity in favor of a Christian nationalist identity.
And girl, yeah, some do. Some of them put their faith over solidarity, remind you, with the struggles of African Americans. And that's one of the things I loved about El Haj Malik El Shabazz. Y'all know him as Malcolm X. But listen, this man was a devout Muslim, but he understood that he was Black first.
So as you can see, brothers and sisters, today, this afternoon, it's not our intention to discuss religion. We're going to forget religion. If we bring up religion, we'll be in an argument. And the best way to keep away from arguments and differences, as I said earlier, put your religion at home, in the closet. Keep it between you and your God. Because if it hasn't done anything more for you than it has, you need to forget it anyway.
Now, he was definitely taking a shot at other faiths with that last line, most likely Christianity, but he still got his point through. You guys understood exactly what he was saying. which is that in this particular matter, Black lives, in this particular matter, this is more important than faith. And you heard Brother Malcolm. The question is, should we take his advice and keep our religion at home and out of policy? Yes or no? Tell us what you think.
Thank you for tuning into The Black Progressive. Keep the conversation going by following us on Facebook and Twitter at BLCKPROG.
And remember, folks, make progress, not excuses.